The scams might be conducted from inside Myanmar, Laos, Cambodia, whatever. But for sure, these people don't want to leave their money in those countries, right? They want to get their money into high value assets. They'll extract money, convert it to crypto, convert it to fiat, change it back, put it through different crypto exchanges, through different shell companies, bank accounts, into yachts, luxury products, bottles of wine. And it ends up in luxury properties in London, in Singapore, Taiwan, Xiamen, wherever. It's flowing through multiple jurisdictions under the nose of many, many regulators, and many people that should be doing better due diligence, and we're starting to see now these choke points are getting pinched, but there needs to be more of that.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back to BungaCast, the global politics podcast at the end of history. I'm Alex O'Healy in São Paulo, Brazil, joined today by contributing editor Lee Jones in London. Hello, Lee.
Hi there.
And joined by our guest today, Mark Bowe, whom I've forgotten to ask how he would specifically like to be introduced. I could take the bio from the book, which we're going to talk about, which is co-authored by him, but maybe I'll ask Mark to introduce himself.
Yeah, thanks very much, and thanks for having me on. I'm a researcher. I was based for quite a while in Southeast Asia. About 20 years I was there, working in the nonprofit sector. My focus for about the last 15 years or so has been on corporate accountability, financial mapping, and since around about 2018, I started to look into organized crime in the region, starting from Cambodia, and more specifically looking into the spread of online scams that originate from Cambodia, from Myanmar, and Laos, that are targeting the world and very much in the news right now.
Yeah, indeed. Maybe you yourself, listener, have been targeted by such a scam. Lee, have you ever been made a mark? No, that's not a pun on Mark's name. It's just, have you ever been a target of a scam, of an online scam?
Well, I think I've been the target of approaches by Chinese intelligence, but I'm not sure whether that was actually Chinese intelligence or maybe a scam. I'm not entirely sure, but
that's just showing off. That's a higher caliber of being made a target of, I think.
I don't know. Reading Mark's book made me think, was it actually Chinese intelligence or was it some other kind of scam? I'm never entirely sure about these things, but I think, things have got a bit more sophisticated from the old days when you just used to get an email from, General Umbongo saying, I'm a Nigerian prince, I want to transfer $20 million into your bank account, kind of thing.
Yeah.
I think things have got
and you'd only fall for one of those like twice at the most.
Yeah. When it says I'm Tony Blair's attorney and I want to, smuggle him out of prison or something like that. I fell for that one, but yeah, General Umbongo, no. Fool me twice, shame on me, and so on.
Right. So
I did see a poll just yesterday, actually, came out. Nationwide Building Society, which is kind of like a bank here, had commissioned a poll saying that on average, British people receive 2 scam phone calls per week, which is pretty remarkable. And I guess a lot of those are not originating from the scam centers that we will talk about today, but I could be wrong about that.
Yeah, maybe. I'm actually be interested to know. I mean, here in Brazil, I actually was a little bit surprised hearing you say that stat because the kind of scam economy, I guess, is so much more developed and present in Brazil. And I went to look up some statistics after hearing your one about receiving 2 scam approaches per week. Apparently in Brazil, people receive on average 252 scam approaches or have scam encounters per year in Brazil. So I guess that's something like 2 every 3 days. And 75% of Brazilians believe they can recognize scams, but 70% have fallen victim to at least one within the past year, which, you can read into that stat as you wish. But I guess maybe that would apply to many of us that we think, no, we're skeptical, perhaps even cynical, wouldn't fall for these things. So I went to look for some examples just to kind of enrich this story, at least from my perspective here in Brazil, where I think people talk about scams all the time. Oh, I received this scam. Someone called me up pretending to be such and such. So apparently 2 months ago, police in Greater Rio arrested suspects using AI to create personalized prayers which they sold for around 50 reais each. So it's about $10 or something. And so callers would collect personal information from those that they were reaching out to, did research on their marks, and then offered unique prayers designed to, bring healing or solace to suffering people. And some individuals purchased multiple AI prayers. And I mean, that is a whole story unto itself about what it reveals. But maybe, you hear that and you think, well, you have to be a little bit gullible for that,
I don't know, the God in the machine.
Right. Yeah, maybe. But I guess that's very revelatory of Brazil, and maybe what we're going to learn a lot about is stuff that might be revelatory about Southeast Asia, about Cambodia, etc. I certainly found it reading this fascinating book. But I could cite more plausible examples from Brazil. I mean, my grandmother was targeted by scammers who had cloned her daughter, my aunt's WhatsApp. It looked exactly like her WhatsApp. I think it came from the same number, and asked, and I can't remember exactly the reasoning they gave, but asking for money to be transferred via Pix, which is Brazil's federal payments transfer system, instant payment system like Venmo, except it's run by the state and it's free to use. And she, fell for it. And then obviously my aunts were screaming at their mother for having been such a dupe for these things, but she's like, no, but it looked exactly like her, and she was saying it was an emergency and she just needed, I don't know how much it was, so I needed $500 really quickly. It was quite urgent.
Yeah.
So
I know very smart people who have fallen victim to scams, and it reminds me of, what Mark says about the people who are absorbed into these centers, the people that are recruited to work in them. Some people want to write them off and say, well, how could you be so stupid? Surely you must have known. But these things are very sophisticated. They're not just targeting perhaps vulnerable or less tech savvy older people, although there is that. But I think, very smart, savvy people can easily fall prey to these kinds of scams. And it has become a massive global issue, which is why we wanted to get Mark on to talk about it with his book.
Yeah, absolutely. And I want to bring Mark in a second just to tell you the book is called Scams Inside Southeast Asia's Cybercrime Compounds, and it was co-authored with Ivan Franceschini and Ling Li. And what's fascinating about it, and you couldn't tell from just looking at the cover, I guess, but it delves quite deeply into what is the intersection of organized crime, of new technology, and kind of some of the social effects of it, like atomization and loneliness, of unfree labor, and of compound capitalism, or the way that contemporary capitalism seeks to carve out autonomous zones where national laws don't apply, and how this often features collusion between private interests and local public authorities. I guess mention of that should tell listeners why we, in particular at this podcast, were interested in discussing this book. For more on that, also, I guess listeners should check out episodes 331 and 332, in which we talked to Quinn Slobodian about his book, Crack Up Capitalism. But this book, Scams, provides something different. It's actually a detailed work of investigation featuring interviews with victims, many of them survivors from these scam compounds in Southeast Asia. And I found it a riveting read and also kind of chilling at times. I mean, I do want to bring Mark in and stop talking, but I just wanted to give a personal example of one moment in the book about halfway through, which I kind of went, eesh. Yeah, like talking about people who think that they're smart and think they wouldn't fall for these things. And I thought, I'd probably fall victim to that. So on page 129, we found this interviewee, a former scammer, explaining that, quote, the scam is about finding the weaknesses of a human being. The goal is to find out what you need the most and fill that gap. It can be about your work, business, family life, or anything about your desire for emotional support. The scammers take their time to record your life, everything, every detail about your life, end quote. And then this is followed shortly after with an example of a 40-year-old Chinese woman who's tricked into falling in love with a scammer who claimed themselves to be detained by a scamming ring in Myanmar. So, if you're sympathetic to the people who've been trafficked into these scamming rings, you might yourself fall victim to one of these scams because you might be seeking to help one of these people. And this woman was cheated out of tens of thousands of dollars. But the authors, Mark included, tell us shortly after that while the techniques of scammers are already highly sophisticated, AI tools are creating new deep fake scams. And then I started to kind of fantasize cases where the voice of a loved one is begging me to send them money and wondering, whether I would be skeptical or cynical enough to say no, or indeed worry about having turned down the cries of a loved one for help. So, you can imagine how one might fall for these types of scams. So we should hear much more from Mark. So I'm going to pass on to Lee first, who suggested we do this episode and this book, and bring in Mark to talk a lot more about this.
Yeah, so can we begin, Mark? Can you just tell, for the sake of our listeners who haven't been targeted by these scams, what are we talking about when we come to these scams? Can you run through some of the most important and common ones? We hear terms like pig butchering quite a lot, but I also found new ones in the book like fish butchering. So what are we talking about here?
Yeah, there is many types of scams that are being operated out of these centers. I think that they're constantly evolving. They're adapted to different targets as well. Like you said, I think now the term pig butchering has become quite well known. It's an unpleasant term, but it's one that's used by the industry itself, and it refers to this idea of first kind of making contact with the potential victim, then fattening them up through building a relationship. Sometimes it's a romantic relationship, sometimes it's just friendship, but fattening them up. Usually it will start with a fake wrong number message. So someone will message you and say, "Hey, it's John, how you doing?" And then you reply and say, I'm not John. And they say, "Oh, I've got the wrong number, I'm really sorry." And then they'll just follow up with that and say, "Well, how are you doing today?" And then most people won't reply to that. Some will, and then those that do, they initiate this conversation, keep it going. If they get this person on the hook, very often the kind of frontline person will then pass it to someone who's a bit more experienced, and then they'll start to steer the conversation towards some type of investment. So it's usually some kind of digital currency, a crypto, or something like that, and they will direct them to a platform and say, this is what I've been investing on, and you should try it. And they'll encourage them, just put $20 in, $50, and they'll see on this website that they're making money, they're making good money, but really the website it's bogus, and it's controlled by the operation that's contacted them in the first place. And so over time, building up that trust, fattening up the pig, as they say, they'll invest more, and they'll be encouraged to put larger amounts in, and they'll keep this going on. Very, very manipulative, very emotionally manipulative sometimes, the way that they get people to put their money in. And then when finally they say, hang on, something's up here, I want to take my money out, then they just disappear and they lose everything. So butchering the pig. So that's one that's become really common and very well known, because there's now a lot of cases where people have lost very large amounts of money, sometimes in hundreds of thousands of dollars or even more, through these kind of scams. But there are a lot more. Law enforcement impersonation scams are incredibly common, and we've seen them targeting people all over the world now. So here someone will call, they might pretend to be the police or some kind of regulator, like a banking regulator, and they'll make the victim think that they've done something wrong. If it's the police, they'll say, we intercepted a suspicious package going to your address, or your phone number has been connected to a scam, funnily enough. And then they'll get those people to do things like transfer the contents of their bank into a special escrow account while it's investigated. And then, of course, the money disappears. So that's incredibly common, targeting people in China and India, Thailand. There's been quite a few raids in the region, especially in Cambodia, where when the police have gone in, they found elaborate sets for police stations with props, Chinese police uniforms, even Japanese police uniforms we saw recently. So very sophisticated. Yeah, all other kinds of impersonations. So when you might have seen those emails you get that say your Netflix subscription, there's a problem with the payment. They're very good at impersonating Netflix or Apple or whoever else. There might just be one letter that's off in the email address that it's coming from. And they say, click here to update your payment details. And so you click there, and of course you go to their website and you give them your bank details. Or even worse, clicking on the link puts some kind of malware on your device that can then be used to track what you're doing and get into your apps and other accounts and things like that. Yeah, many. I could go on and on, but there like there's several in the book there.
There are many others. I'll just give a very quick list of some of the others: romance scams, fish butchering, investment scams, blackmail scams, e-commerce scams, and predatory loan scams. But if listeners want to find out the full details of all of those, they will, of course, have to buy the book. Now, what's really interesting about all of this is that it is now an industry, the massive scale of this, and you analyze it as an industry, as a kind of economic sector, and then you analyze it down to the compounds that have become the kind of key nodes in this sector. So beyond the anecdotes about Alex's poor grandma and my General Umbongo emails, give us a sense of the scale of this industry now. How many people are working in it? What's the total volume of scams? I know these things are very difficult. We never really know because it's criminal, but there are estimates floating around there.
Yeah, like you say, it's massive. It's truly global, and I think you have to acknowledge that before the industry really blew up in Southeast Asia, it existed before that. Scams are centuries old, but especially kind of modern scams done by phone or online, they predate this kind of new phenomenon that we see in Southeast Asia, but it's really become a keynote now in the global like online fraud space. I think if we look at Southeast Asia, what's really remarkable is the pace at which it grew from almost nothing 15 years ago. We started to see signs of it around 2010, and then by 2015, these huge compounds were starting to be built, and in almost no time at all, they were operational and staffed by thousands of people. So we've managed to identify across Cambodia, Myanmar, Laos, Philippines, more than 500 specific sites. So they vary in size, but some of those are huge. Some could easily accommodate upwards of 10,000 people in a single compound. And those are just the ones that we've managed to find. And there will be many, many more. In terms of like the revenues, how much money has been made, it's really difficult to estimate. A lot of estimates have been put out. I think some of them are more reliable than others. I'm reluctant to kind of embrace anyone in particular because I think they all have, good points and weak points. I think you have to keep in mind most fraud is not reported by victims. So there's undercounting. Not all countries disclose data. So it's really hard for us to get that kind of overall figure. Different countries use different methodologies. If we can find data, sometimes it's not disaggregated. So it might just say fraud. We don't know what type of fraud, or it might be online fraud, but we don't know exactly where that's coming from. But if we look at some specific examples, so in the US, the US government said last year 10 billion was lost to online fraud, probably coming from Southeast Asia. So that's just one country, 10 billion. And if we look at the US, turn to China, China has been the target of these scam operations for much longer than the US. There's much more experience within the industry targeting mainland Chinese, but also Chinese-speaking world. So I'm sure it's much, much higher, and there's a lot more people as well. So that gives you an example of the scale. I think UNODC, the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime, they estimated in 2023 that within Asia Pacific, conservatively, up to 37 billion was lost in 2023. So really, it's a lot of money. And I think there's a lot that we don't even know about. And of course, that's facilitated by this huge workforce. Some people are there willingly. Many have been trafficked into the industry. Some might have gone in willingly and then they can't get out of it. But it's a huge workforce. The UN estimated a few years ago, just in Myanmar, Cambodia, the workforce was upwards of 200,000. I think that was probably a good estimate at the time. But I think if we look at the region more broadly, it's going to be way higher than that. So it's really a huge industry.
Yeah, absolutely massive. And just give us a sense of, you mentioned that 10, 15 years ago, this really started to boom in Southeast Asia. Just give us a bit of the prehistory, because the industry started in Taiwan in the early 90s, right? And it seems to me the story that you tell is one of the typical balloon effect of trying to deal with crime, is that when it's suppressed in one place, it squeezes out, like squeezing a balloon, it pops up somewhere else. So you've got the crackdowns driving its relocation. But it also seems to me you can tell a story about the emergence of this scam industry alongside the development of globalization, particularly economic liberalization and the opening up of cross-border trade and flows of people, infrastructure, and so on.
Yeah, when we were researching the book, we wanted to try and trace the origins of this because it did emerge very suddenly. I think it was there before a lot of people knew, including ourselves. A lot of people were not aware of what was kind of building up for at least the first 5 years. But even that is a very quick, a very rapid development that we've seen. So we wanted to know, like, how did they get here? They didn't just come from nowhere. So we looked back through newspaper reports and academic articles as well in Chinese, mainland Chinese and Taiwanese journals. We found that the origins could be traced to Taiwan in the 1990s. So this was obviously before most people were online, especially as online as we are now. So it was largely on the phone. It was phone calls to people, various kind of lottery scams. You might have won a TV or whatever. So those phone scams, they were targeting people inside Taiwan, but also in mainland China. Like you said, when law enforcement started to squeeze that, they moved over to the mainland, especially to Fujian, which is, close proximity to Taiwan. And also there are kind of, there are long linkages between Fujianese community and people in Taiwan. And you saw these clusters of operations start in Fujian. They were doing online gambling, so online casinos, but also online scams. And it was, in some cases, very localized. So you can point to some specific villages and towns where there was this booming scam industry. We saw that move out of those areas. So eventually it spread across China, but Fujian was really kind of an epicenter at the beginning. And then again, when the Chinese police started to crack down on it there, it started to shift out. And then you start to see around the 2010 point, smaller operations were starting to get busted in Cambodia and in Philippines as well. We started to see a lot of the online casinos that were previously inside China targeting Chinese. They moved into the Philippines where it was much safer. They were out of the reach of Chinese law enforcement, basically. And so then once in Southeast Asia, they laid down roots and then expanded really quickly. So I think, speaking to what Lee said in terms of kind of this globalization effect, I think you can definitely say that interconnection between those countries played a part. There was also a lot of legitimate Chinese investment flowing into the region. Cambodia is a very good example. A lot of Chinese investment coming in, and I think really the people piggybacked on that investment. That they ran in parallel. I think often they're kind of conflated, but it was more kind of two industries working in parallel, and for sure the illicit industries benefited from the new roads that were going in, the improved transport infrastructure, the frequency of flights, and so on. So I think it really came along with that developing integration between Southeast Asian nations and integration of China within ASEAN as well.
I think what's interesting is that as much as this can be told, as Lee has indicated, and you've said now, Mark, that it, as a sort of dark side of globalization story, it's also, one motif in the story is also of the global shutdown, because it often appears that people who have been trafficked into working in these scam compounds in conditions sort of analogous to slavery or modern slavery conditions have been driven into that situation because of COVID and the lockdowns and the economic situations arising from that. And so can you tell us a little bit more about this? Because I don't know if this is just an artifact of when you did your interviews, but it comes across, it seems like every other story and every other interviewee that whose story you relate says, well, this came soon after COVID and I was desperate. And so it seems to me like the story there is that you have a pool of qualified, unemployed labor, which seems to be an important supply side factor in this whole story.
Yeah, COVID was definitely an important factor. I think sometimes it's a bit overplayed. I would say if COVID never happened, this industry would still be here for sure. I think looking at it through the prism of the pandemic and the shutdown, I think as you said in the book, it might be an artifact of when we did the research and when we talked to people. I think one thing that is definitely true is that many of the people that end up trapped inside these compounds. So, like I said, that there are people that go in there willingly for whatever reason. Some might be going in because they think they can make money, but a lot of those people are going in because they feel like they don't really have many other options, or the options that they have are not going to pay them enough money. So we've heard from a lot of people from Indonesia, especially, like very limited job prospects where they are young, quite hopeless, not many options for them. And then a lot of those people, we've seen quite a lot of evidence of people basically being groomed to go into these places. So there are recruiters, they might be kind of freelance working outside of the compounds, they might work inside the compounds, but they approach people online. We've seen this with Chinese, with Indonesian, with Vietnamese, and they tell them how much money they can make if they come. And they might give them a partial story of what they might be doing. They might say, "Oh, it's just online gambling. Like, yeah, it's not legal, but it's just gambling. It's no one cares." And then when they get there, they find out that they're actually going to be working in scam operations, and their passport's taken away. They can't leave. They can be bought. They can be sold. They can be subject to all kinds of violence. But many of those people, they are. I don't want to make excuses for people that do go in there, with bad intentions. If that's the case, they need to be held accountable for that. But I think many of the people going in there are going in because they feel that they have limited options where they are. That can be because of where they're from, the kind of economic situation there, job opportunities there, but it's not just like lower income people. We've seen people from say more middle class backgrounds. For example, India, we've seen a lot of men from India coming into the region. A lot of them are qualified. They've got IT degrees, but they've gone to university. They've come out of university, and there are thousands of other guys with the same degree as them, and there are no jobs. And so they end up looking for jobs overseas. They might go to Dubai. They might end up starting work in something that's legitimate. It might be IT, it might be customer services. But then once they're out in they're working abroad, then they're looking at various recruitment channels. There's various like proactive recruitment platforms looking for them, and they get sucked into Southeast Asia, into Myanmar, into Cambodia, and again trapped. They might have gone in, let's say, willingly, especially in the eyes of some law enforcement. But once they're in there, they can get stuck. And I think it's a long answer to your question. To come back to COVID, I think that really compounded that, because obviously I think many of these places, they already had these problems before the pandemic, but then the pandemic, caused chaos, like massive economic damage. Lots of people lost their jobs and so on. So I think that really really amplified the problems that were there prior to that.
And it also amplified the problem for the scam centers, right? Because if you're operating these centers on such an industrial scale, right, hundreds of thousands of workers are required to operate these, quite labor intensive. You need lots of people. I mean, initially, this was targeting the Chinese mainland in particular, right? Chinese speaking places. So also Taiwan, Singapore, places like this. So you need Chinese speaker, and you need people that are basically a bit tech savvy, right? Can type and can navigate the internet and stuff like that. And there's a finite pool of people like that who are willing to come and work in these centres, notwithstanding the drivers like you're talking about from poor economic prospects. But there was always a challenge. So you kind of have to trick people into coming to these jobs, promise them a job that's not as described, and then, grab them on arrival and traffic them into the centres. But I think the story also that you tell with COVID is that intensifies the difficulties that the scam centres have in recruiting. So they actually start abducting people and then smuggling them either internationally, or, you tell stories about, particularly in Sihanoukville in Cambodia, Chinese-speaking people being, practically abducted off the streets, or if they owed money to somebody, that person would, tip off the scam centers to come and abduct them at a particular point in time, and that became much more coercive, it seems to me. The lockdowns drove the centres to be much more coercive in order to secure the workers that they need. Is that right?
I think there's definitely an element of truth in that. I think there was various things running in parallel. So on one hand, you had very strict travel restrictions came in on the Chinese side. So I think that probably led to an increase in smuggling because people couldn't just, before people were just going on regular commercial flights, and then those flights stopped. Then the borders closed. So then people started to illegally cross land borders or were getting smuggled out on boats. Then they were entering informally as well. So very precarious for them. So not only is their passport seized when they arrive, there's not even any record of them entering the country. So instantly, they're basically commodities as soon as that happens. They can be bought, they can be sold. Very, very, very precarious situation. So there was that. The restrictions, the kind of reduced access to Chinese labor force was definitely a thing. But I think one thing that likely happened is that there was also kind of an ongoing evolution of the industry. So, as you said, to begin with, it was targeting mainland Chinese and then like Sinophone world. But we saw an increase of Vietnamese and Thai coming in. Again, it was much easier for them to get in. It's very, very easy to cross the border informally or formally to work in these places. And there's huge what they call markets in Vietnam and Thailand that you can target with the scams, and also Indonesia. So I think it was, coming back to this idea of it, being an industry. To me, it's kind of a natural evolution of this industry. You don't restrict yourself to one market. They saw dollar signs all over the world. And so I think as the Chinese law enforcement, Chinese government were paying more attention to this, watching people's travel habits, questioning people that were spending a lot of time in these countries and, were seen as suspicious, scrutinizing financial transactions a lot more. They started to look, okay, the risk here is increasing, but then there's all this untapped market in other places. So I think it's overlooked because, it's human nature to kind of look at, where you are. So, people in the UK are seeing stories about this impacting people in the UK, people in the US, the same. But the scams targeting Thai, Vietnamese, Indonesian, Malaysian, really, really high. And I think that's because of this evolution. They could adapt this model to target other people. They could use translation software, and as AI powered translation software gets better, you don't even need to be able to speak that language. But also, there's so many Indonesians in Cambodia right now. I've seen estimates of 90 to 100,000 Indonesians in Cambodia, and according to the embassy, I think they said 80% of those people are working in online. So that's a huge number of people that are there, and they're there to target Indonesians because they know the language, but they also know the culture. They know the different, like if you want to have a natural conversation with someone, you can't really do it with AI. But if you're from there, you can connect with people. So yeah, the COVID, again, long answer to your question, but coming back, like COVID is kind of a thread running through our book, I think, because of, when we were working on it. And it's a really important factor. But I think that's just another factor, among others, that kind of amplified certain aspects of the industry. But what we're looking at is an industry that has adapted to various factors, and that was one of them.
Yes, and as we know from somebody who wrote this a long time ago, that industries have a habit of breaking down Chinese walls and scrambling all over the world. And I just want to add, though, on the China point, because I think there's been a lot of misreporting. I mean, I think this is one of the great strengths of the book, actually, that you tackled this head on, because many of the workers in the scam centers, and certainly a lot of the leadership of the scam centers, is Chinese organized crime. There has often been a sense in the reporting of this that these are Chinese scam centers and somehow linked to the Chinese government. But I think, as you quite rightly say, that the evidence for that is basically non-existent. And there is a stat here I just want to share with listeners that in 2023 alone, China tackled 437,000 cases of what they call telecommunications fraud, with a loss of $45 billion. So the Chinese were the initial targets of all this. But as you say, it's another example of the balloon being squeezed. Risks are intensifying with China. Why not diversify your end markets? And there's a famous scam center compound in Shui Koko, just across the border, the Thai border in Myanmar, where they actually had different buildings had different national flags painted on the outside to indicate which country they were targeting, and they were trying to recruit people speaking different languages. So there are people from dozens of countries working in these scam centers now. But let's zoom into the compounds. So that these are the nodes in this global network. Give us a sense of what these compounds are like. How do they actually operate as a business?
We use the term compound to kind of it covers several different types of facility. There are smaller places. Sometimes it can just be apartments and things like that, villas. We don't really look into that too much. They're scattered all over the country. When we talk about the compounds, there are places like in Sri Koko, like you mentioned, KK Park in Myanmar, but then also Cambodia, huge compounds in the Golden Triangle Special Economic Zone in Laos. They have been purpose built for this. So, from a distance, they might look like a business park, towers and usually walled with security and so on. But they're in places where there is absolutely like zero demand for an office park, for, a modern online office park. There are also casinos, many, many casinos. I would say more than half of the casinos I've looked at have some online activity. It might be in the higher floors, even if they have a public-facing casino downstairs, and they might have floors for customers. Higher floors will be separate. The elevator will not go to those. The public elevator will not go to those floors, and there'll be keycard systems that separate the online part from the public part. Sometimes casinos have separate enclosed compounds behind them, but all of these facilities have similar characteristics. They're enclosed. They have a lot of security guards, high walls, barbed wire, cameras all over, often pointing inwards to monitor what people are doing inside. And you can't come and go. Like I said, most people have their passports taken. Even people that are there willingly will have their passport taken. Inside, in the larger places, you'll have a group of people that own that place. Then you have a property manager that deals with the overall management of the property. And then usually spaces inside will be rented to different scam operators. So they could rent a room, they could rent a floor, they could rent a whole building. So within there, in a single place, you might have multiple different operations targeting different nationalities with different types of scam. Most of the people that we've spoken to that are in kind of larger scam operations, they all explain to us this kind of pyramid structure that you would see in legitimate companies. So workers at the bottom, like I mentioned before, kind of the less skilled people, the newer recruits, they're doing the thing like blasting out those text messages and trying to strike up a conversation. Then you have, according to their experience, people will pass on a potential target onto someone more experienced and so on upwards. So you've got the workers, they'll have a supervisor, then you'll have managers. Yeah, and so profits obviously go to the top and then trickle back down. Usually people get a salary, not always, but it's not very big. You make the money on commissions. So if you're there and you don't want to be there, you either work or you get beaten. Like if you don't perform, you don't get paid. And if you don't perform, you can be subject to all kinds of, often very vicious treatment. It starts small, can be slaps and kicks, but then there's so much footage, there's so much evidence of people being subject to electrocution with batons, vicious beatings. There are a lot of deaths. One thing I was tracking for a while, but I stopped because it was It was too hard to keep up, and it was far too depressing how many people were dying. Many of them are falling from the building. Sometimes the circumstances are suspicious, but I think many of them probably are suicides because they're incredibly, desperate places. So violence, death is common throughout the industry, and this like very rigid structure that we talk about in the book with the idea of compound capitalism. These are kind of enclaves, that the zones where it's not like regulation is weak. Regulation is there. They're breaking so many laws, but within these zones, they can operate without interference. And then inside, they have these structures that both maximize extraction from those workers, working to commissions, a lot of them talk about having KPIs, even, key performance indicators like you would have in a company. So maximum extraction from those people in order to get maximum extraction from the scam victims at the other end.
Yeah, I mean, it's hearing you say that, and obviously having read the book as well, it strikes me that how exemplary this is of degenerate tendencies in contemporary capitalism, maybe in one sense at the top of towards speculation and indeed just kind of outright gangsterism, and then kind of at the bottom in terms of labor relations of the use of unfree labor and types of modern slavery, which maybe we can reflect on a bit later. I also just wanted to make a comment, just because gambling is, as you know, quite central to all this, and indeed, the history of these scam compounds is tied to big casino interests in Macau and Hong Kong and so on, and rather than this just being a Southeast Asia story that just pertains to that region and indeed particularly to the less developed parts of that region. If you think about something like in the British Premier League, the English Premier League, that 50% of shirt sponsors this year were from gambling companies. Now, the clubs have taken a move to ban front of shirt gambling sponsors. So of course you can have gambling sponsors sponsor the club in some other ways, or have a sleeve sponsor or whatever, but the big front of shirt one. So anyway, it's one of these very limited kind of silly remedial measures, which doesn't really deal with the problem at all. But as many people have commented, a lot of these gambling companies are not even established ones, like whatever you can think. I'm not even going to name them, but there are more established ones which you think, well, at least a big chunk of their business is legitimate, even if there might be shady elements to it. But some of these things are just outright front companies, right, for all sorts of kind of illicit activity. So that's one way in which these things really penetrate right into the core of the Western bubble. It's not something kind of far away. But I did have a question. I mean, you obviously feel free to comment on that if you want. But my question was actually on some of maybe the social effects of this, because I think we all can imagine how corrosive scams are in terms of the victims. I mean, just the outsider victims, the scammed as they are. But as you know, and you actually are at pains to note at the start of the book that there's this victim offender overlap in terms of the scammers. People are trafficked into the industry and therefore the perpetrators, and are scammers, but of course themselves have been duped into slavery of some sort, effectively. And what's amazing, and I wanted to invite you to speak a little bit more about this, is that of course scams themselves are socially corrosive because you begin to mistrust a phone call. So to take the example from my family, my grandmother might now be suspicious if she receives a call or a message from her daughter because she's been scammed that way before through a cloned number. But what's shocking is the amount of cases that you encountered in which friends and family have recruited people into the scam business, and then they find themselves in some sense trapped in these compounds because of debt or physically prevented from leaving.
Yeah, I think that the corrosiveness is like full spectrum. So, yeah, like you said, on the side of the victims of the actual scams, it's really making people distrustful. It's making me very distrustful. Looking at this for several years now, it's not great for your mental health, to be honest. But it impacts on all sides. So you've got the victims there, you've got people being pulled into the industry. We found, talking to people, a lot of people that ended up being trapped inside the compounds, they didn't actually apply for a job or get approached by a recruiter. It was someone, sometimes it's family, but often it's they might say friend, but it could be someone from that they went to school with, or they went to high school with. A lot of the time, it's people from their village or from their area, and especially in China, when you've got Laoxiang, the people, your people from where you're from, that they'll contact you and they speak your dialect. They, like I said, they might have gone to school with you, but they build up this kind of this connection, and then they encourage people to come. We've seen the same in Indonesia. One or two people will go from a village working for some online gambling platform or online scam, and then they'll be encouraged, like, call your friends back in your village and get them to come, and they'll persuade people to come. So yeah, really, really, really damaging in terms of that kind of community cohesion. And then as well, around the compounds, I think for a long time, me included, I saw these things as kind of islands within the localities where they are. But as we look more, you could say there's a large compound built somewhere on the coast in Sihanoukville. You'll have Cambodian laborers. Many people work in construction in Cambodia, and they just move from place to place looking for work. They'll work on the building until it's finished, then they'll go and find another one. So you had all these construction workers gravitating towards these places. And so with this expanding so rapidly and these huge buildings going up, it became a major source of employment for people. So it's, to me, like, destructive. It's destroying Cambodia. Take the Cambodia example. Long term, the damage this is doing to Cambodia economically and reputationally, socially, is huge. But in the short term, generated loads of employment for construction workers.
Hello friends, you've reached the end of a sample from an episode only available to subscribers. We put out 2 episodes a month for free. For access to the rest in its entirety, please join us at patreon.com/bungacast. For $7 a month, subscribers receive original, exclusive episodes with the entirety of the BungaCast cast. That's George Hoare, myself Alex Hochuli, and our contributing editors, Philip Cunliffe, Amber Lee Frost, Catherine Liu, Lee Jones, Alex Gurevich, and Lee Phillips. We've got extended interviews with guests, episodes on current affairs, and original episodes on theory, history, and culture, so as to understand the crises of our times. We also have the BungaCast Reading Club, where Phil, George, and myself present the key books and essays necessary for understanding the world today, how we got here, and where we might be going. Subscribers also get a digital subscription to Damage Magazine, with whom we're partnered, and you can find all this info at patreon.com/bungacast. We do hope you'll join us. These are turbulent times, and ideologically confused ones as well. What we try to do is find political clarity, to move beyond the decadent age of Bunga Bunga.